are delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, produced by Dettol, Banega Swasth India. It is our pleasure to present today Move, Relentless Motion, Parag Khanna in conversation with Chinmay Tumbe. Move, Relentless Motion. One of the only things that remain constant among humans is change. Global strategist, futurist, and best-selling author Parag Khanna's newest book, Move, nudges readers to introspect about the unabating pattern of mobility that our species has followed. Presenting a daring and intriguing narrative, Khanna aims his wide lens at the emerging trends of mobility that the human race is setting into motion with climate change, economic collapse, and political destabilization. In conversation with Chinmay Tumbe, Khanna illuminates the new realities that we will face in the future and explores the nature of this relentless motion in his customary authoritative and thought-provoking manner. Parag Khanna. Parag Khanna is a leading global strategy advisor, world traveler, and best-selling author. He is the founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. His published novels include Move, The Forces Uprooting Us, The Futurization, Commerce, Conflict in Culture in the 21st Century, The Second World, Empires and Influence in the New Global Order and Technocracy in America, Rise of the Info State. Khanna was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century and featured in Wired magazine's Smart List. Chinmay Tumbe. Chinmay Tumbe is a faculty member in the economics area of the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and the author of India Moving, A History of Migration and the Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920. How they shaped India and the world. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comments section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag Jaipur LitFest. Ladies and gentlemen, Move, Relentless Motion. Parag Khanna in conversation with Chinmay Tumbe.
We are in conversation with Parag Khanna, who's written this really nice book called Move. He's a prolific writer, and I'm going to start with that question, Parag. Where do you get the time to write so much?
Thank you so much, Chinmay. Great to see you. Great to be back with JLF, and hopefully next time in person, as we've been hoping for, of course, for the last couple of years. Well, maybe that's a good place to start in answering the question. The reduced travel of the last 2 years has shown me, quantified for me, how much time I spent going to and from airports, checking in and out of flights, packing and unpacking baggage. And every minute of that time has now gone into productive work, as opposed to idly toiling in airports. So that's one way, but basically that's an example of how I just scrape time wherever I can and just put it together, because it is a hobby, it is a side job. You know, writing is like a hustle almost, but I shouldn't say hustle, it's a passion project. It is a passion project.
Yeah. And when did you get the idea of writing a book on migration?
Well, so in a way, this is a book about human geography, and migration is a subset of human geography. And that helps to answer the question, because fundamentally, in my heart of hearts, I'm a geographer. You know, my academic passion, my intellectual passion is geography. So it is therefore fitting that after having done a book like Connectography, which was about functional geography and infrastructure, I wanted to answer the simple question, what will we do with it all? What will we do with the highways and railways and internet cables and electricity grids and infrastructure that we're building? And the answer is, it will enable our mobility. It enables and accelerates our response to disruptions or opportunities. And so I wanted to paint in a way, this is really a sequel to Connectography, but human geography instead of functional geography.
And you start your book with a course you took in the 90s on maps. Tell us a bit about that. How are you so passionate about maps, and how does that inform this book, which has a lot of stunning maps?
When you say 90s, you make me sound so old, you know. It wasn't really that long ago, but it was definitely another era, that's for sure. And I got obsessed with cartography really just from traveling so much as a child, my family taking me everywhere ever since we moved out of India. And so in that sense, travel is the origin of the love for geography and therefore cartography. And in high school, I went to high school in Germany actually, so I studied earth science as one of my subjects in school, and that also got me into it. But definitely the maps, in a very formal sense, came from this one class in college called Map of the Modern World. And there we explored political maps, maps of natural geography, maps of infrastructure, and maps of demographics. And what this book explicitly sets out to do, and which is why I pay such a homage to that professor, is that it seeks to reconcile these four very misaligned layers of geography. And that is the greatest crisis in the world today at the most fundamental, deepest, most existential level. I believe that we are suffering from a misalignment of the geography of resources, the geography of borders, the geography of economic activity and infrastructure, and the geography of people. And so much of the friction, so much of the underproductivity, so much of our poverty and other maladies actually stems from this misalignment of geography.
Coming to your book now, you lay out a particular framework in one of the chapters. I work in a management school and we're used to seeing 2x2 charts. So this is a very interesting 2x2 chart in which you draw out phrases which I've never seen, stuff like the Northern Lights, stuff like barbarians at the gate. But the idea that societies can be configured into four types: high migration, low migration, and high sustainability, low sustainability. Take us a bit through this. What is your thinking of this?
Well, framing scenarios is a very complex exercise. You have to do a lot of background thinking before you even decide what the content will be. Otherwise, the content of scenarios will be all over the place and will be far too much overlapping with the others and so forth. So the first thing was to say, what are the driving axes that I'm interested in? And as you mentioned, sort of sustainability on one axis, high or low migration on the other axis. And then, of course, you kind of have an emotional vision almost of what the sentiment of each of those quadrants is going to be. And then you fill in the story and you make them not totally mutually exclusive, because in a way, reality is all of the above, right? Reality is a little bit of each of those scenarios. And then you kind of fill it in. So, you have the low mobility, higher sustainability quadrant, which is regional fortresses. You have the high mobility, high sustainability, which is the Northern Lights. And then you also have the barbarians at the gate in the new Middle Ages. In truth, 3 of these 4 scenarios are actually quite negative. They're quite dire almost. And only Northern Lights is the aspirational one, the one where I normatively sort of, try to become an activist almost. We can do this. We should do this. We have the technology to do this. This is the path to saving our species in a way. But the fact that 3 of the 4 scenarios are indeed so negative suggests obviously that I'm not necessarily an optimist about the future.
You mentioned the idea of the Arctics and the fact that this could be the next big thing in terms of where humans could live. Tell us a bit more about that. I think that's very original, and that's something definitely I've not been reading in migration stuff. What got you this idea, and tell us a bit more about that.
Well, I've actually been kind of grappling with this for more than a decade. In my very first TED Talk, I looked at climate change and demographic shifts, and how inevitably that northern latitudes are on a relative basis better off than equatorial or southern latitudes. And what I also noticed again in writing about human geography is that the world population north of the Arctic Circle is pretty much smaller than a small Indian city, right? Literally. So the entire northern cone of the planet Earth has practically no people, right? A rounding error of 5 or 6 million people, and that would change, but not strictly the Arctic, but just the further north. And let me just give you one data point. I mean, in the year 2021, Russia was the world's largest wheat exporter. If I told you even 10 years ago or 15 years ago that in the year 2021, Russia would be the world's largest wheat exporter, you would laugh at me. right? But that's the pace at which the habitability is changing. Now we have scientific studies that talk about the so-called climate niche, and they posit that for every 1 degree temperature rise, we will have a shift, or 1 billion people will be displaced from the climate niche, right? And so, when I talk about mass migrations at that epic scale, there's now scientific research saying that just even that increment of temperature rise is going to push 1 billion people or more further and further and further north. And as it relates to India, interestingly enough, is, I talk about the reverse Mughal Empire, right? 500 years ago, Central Asian civilizations came south and occupied and dominated and ruled the subcontinent. Now, 500 years later, I am actually witnessing firsthand South Asian populations moving northward into Central Asian countries and the former Soviet republics and to Russia itself. So we are seeing evidence of it happening. And Canada's spectacular population growth is another example of that scenario playing out.
Great. So we were at India and what's happening out there, people going up north. Let's hold a bit on India. Recently, a lot of tensions have been in place between India, Bangladesh, and so on. Your book is a clarion call for more cosmopolitanism, more migration, and yet even countries with large outmigration like India, when it comes to immigration, virtually every country today is very picky, including India. What would you say to the guys in India about, say, migration from Bangladesh to Bangladesh, etc.?
Well, internal to South Asia, obviously, there is not a lot of formal cross-border migration other than labor migration for very specific time-bound purposes. So it's not a region of high internal migration compared to other regions, but it's in a region of enormous out migration. And that's really the central theme that I tackle. South Asia's collective population is far larger than China. So again, if the principal countries of South Asia were one country, it would be 1.8 billion people, right? India alone effectively has as many people as China. Now, of all countries in the world, India has by far, the most annual out migration, right? It is a sort of an order of magnitude larger than almost any other country. Because if you think about Indian demographics, it's a younger median age, a higher propensity or desire to migrate away from the country, a very large pre-existing diaspora, a set of skills, whether it's English language or medicine, nursing, or IT and others that are in demand elsewhere in the world. And at this point now also geopolitical suspicions that point to China, but are more favorable towards India. Every one of those factors points to the Indian diaspora relatively soon becoming much larger than the Chinese diaspora. And that overtaking of the global ethnographic footprint, the pole position that India will really presume, numerically, is a big theme in the book. And it's something that people have not really wrapped their heads around yet, even though it's unfolding very quickly. Already, if you look at just the professional workforce of OECD countries, there's 1 million more Indians than Chinese already today.
You mentioned this whole thing between urbanization. On the one hand, a lot of people say for the first time in humanity, more than half the global population is living in cities. At the same time, you mentioned at one point in the book that maybe with this new post-pandemic world emerging, we have an opportunity for more people to live in smaller settlement sizes. How do you see this panning out in the next 50 years? Are we going to cluster as we have always in more density, higher agglomeration places, or some sort of a fundamental reordering is in place?
It's a great question, and it's obviously been posed a lot during this pandemic. Early on, people said, well, this is the death of the city, and look at how people were leaving Los Angeles and New York anyway because of the high cost of living and just other factors. But the truth is the city itself always wins. We have been urbanizing for 7,000 years, and we will continue to agglomerate. Now, whether or not the triumphant size of city is a megalopolis or something more mid-size there isn't one answer to that. It will depend on where and the geography and the natural resources and the population of that country and those kinds of things. But make no mistake that the city always wins. And even when people proclaim the death of the city and they actually only mean New York and Los Angeles, chances are, A, they're wrong about New York and Los Angeles, and B, those who have left those cities have moved to other cities. So the city didn't lose. When Seattle wins and Toronto wins and Austin, Texas wins and Boise, Idaho and Berlin and Almaty and so forth collect people, the city is still winning. And those cities that I just mentioned are of all different shapes and sizes. So I have no doubt that we'll always agglomerate, even with all of the opportunities for remote work. And one other point that should be almost self-evident to Indians and to Asians is that people move to cities for reasons that go beyond whether or not you have a faster internet connection there. And having a fast rural internet connection does not at all ameliorate the conditions that drive people to move to cities, which are, of course, higher wages, higher quality of life, access to medical care, education, connectivity, transportation, a wide range of factors. So I think that we will always, always pursue this very fundamental human impulse to move to cities and connect to other people.
The subtitle of your book is, how mass migration will reshape the world. And one interesting aspect of that in the book is about how, while USA is typically seen as the land of mass immigration, there are also people leaving the USA. Tell us a bit about that and what you call as Expatstan and so on.
Right. So most people don't think about this, of course, precisely because the US is the ultimate winner, or has been for a couple of centuries, from global migration towards it. And it still is in many ways. But the fact that several million people, have become American expats, or I should say close to 10 million people, meaning half of which have occurred in just the past decade, tells you something about Americans' own favorability towards their own country and the rise of other places, zones of opportunity. So I give examples of Americans moving to Europe. There was a popular show on the home gardening channel in America about rebuilding fixer-upper homes in Italy that were purchased for €1. And this television show would track these middle-class families in America that moved to Italy and bought a home for €1, and they were living the happiest, most fabulous lives. So that literally sparked a wave of people, moving. A lot of people have claimed their birthright heritage in Germany or in Poland or whatever the case may be. So Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe have really been beneficiaries of an American outflow. Now, during the pandemic, that also applies to places like Panama and the Dominican Republic and Bali. You can find Americans who are either chasing, looking for low tax places to go. And Expatistan kind of blends a bit with the whole passport for sale market, which really blends into upper high or sort of, upper middle class and high net worth individuals that participate in this very active citizenship market. And that is also something that I profile in detail in the book, because it's not just about how many people do it, because it may just be, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 people. But when you're talking about millionaires, it makes a material difference. Now, again, we can bring it back to India, because as you well know, not only do millions of, is there a significant outflow of Indians every year, but the fact is it's also a lot of high net worth individuals who purchase citizenship in Canada or in England or in other European countries.
One of the big constraints of global mobility is language. We often tend to see Indians move to English-speaking countries, UK, Australia, Canada, USA, or the erstwhile countries in Africa, which were colonized by the French, going to France. If indeed the world is going to become more mobile in the next 50 years, how big of a constraint will language be? Or will we see some sort of a new global lingua franca like English, which everyone has to speak?
No, in fact, I think you've already answered the question. We're already in that world, even especially in polyglot cities, English is the common denominator, and you can cite more and more cities in the world that are not indigenously English speaking, where you can get by in English. Just look at Berlin, again, a place that I've lived off and on for 30 years. Germans complain that they have, an influx of people who don't even bother to learn German, because you can completely live your life functionally speaking English there. So more and more places have become like that. And I'm almost now consider it a foregone conclusion that English has already become the de facto global language and will remain that way, and that there really is no conceivable risk to its status.
We'll come now to the major topic of our times, which is Russia and Putin. You mentioned at one place, as much as Putin would hate to admit it, he can't rebuild the Soviet Union without accepting the Soviet Union's vast ethnic diversity from Baltic to Asiatic peoples. Now that what is unfolding in the Russian, European theater, is migration, is it going to keep a dampener on migration? I know it's too early to say anything, but what are your general views of what's happening out there?
Well, there's many migration-related aspects to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. One is the fact that obviously it's going to produce a wave of political refugees and asylum seekers, just like the collapse of Syria or Afghanistan or other countries, but not quite at that scale, because many Ukrainians who live in Western Ukraine, which is actually the rump of the population, won't actually leave Western Ukraine because it's not a territory that Russia, I think, can fully occupy for an extended duration of time. So, but still, it's going to create a refugee crisis. Secondly, let's remember that the largest population of foreigners in Russia are Ukrainians. Ukrainians are by far the largest foreign group in Russia itself. And most of them probably will actually stay there because they're there for economic reasons. And some of them may go back actually to fight if they're allowed to go back, but many of them will not. Many of them may even defect because they will feel that the writing is on the wall and that their motherland has been crushed and destroyed. So the fact is that all of the above are going to happen, and political conflicts always have demographic and migratory consequences. And I cite political violence, civil wars, and international conflicts as historically one of the biggest drivers of human migration. Obviously, we need look no further than the partition of India and Pakistan, which is the largest single political event causing a mass migration in human history.
Take you now to another part of the world, which is Japan and South Korea. Both countries, fascinating countries, massive economic revolutions of the last 5 decades. But when I have visited these places, you do get a tinge of xenophobia. Now, you talk a lot about demographic imbalances, the fact that a lot of the aging countries will need immigrants and so on. But my sense is that these political movements in these two countries in particular have still not caught up with the realities of a fast aging population and getting immigrants. Do you think the future will have to be more immigration for Japan and South Korea? Is that an inevitability?
Yes, but let's remember that even though they're both wealthy East Asian countries, they're not like entities in the terms of this question, because Korea is a much smaller country than Japan, and Japan is way more significant in the world economy. And Japan actually is changing course on its immigration policy. Just last year, they granted permanent residency rights to semi-skilled residents. So you actually have Nepali construction workers in Japan who are permanent residents of Japan, and they even want to be in Japan. They can see themselves being in Japan. No one goes to Korea and says, oh yes, I want to live in Korea for the rest of my life. So these are apples and oranges, even though they may be culturally similar in some ways. So Japan, it really is the country that should be the center of our attention in this particular question, because it is demonstrating in many ways how even a place like Japan, even a place that's so insular and associated with xenophobic sentiment, can actually change its tune given how acute their demographic crisis is. And as we know from many other spheres of life, as goes Japan, so goes the rest of the world. They're often a leader in this regard. But that said, we don't actually have to look to Japan for our future immigration policy. We obviously, again, look to Canada, right? Canada is the place that's most representative of the future, because they've recognized faster than everyone else that having a low fertility rate and an aging population and a high dependency ratio and major fiscal stress means that you need to import people like crazy. And in Canada, immigration policy is economic policy. I've studied the country very closely, spent a lot of time there. As you know, there's a very strong national consensus that no government should waver from this policy of increasing the population by 1% per year, which amounts to 400,000 people. Over the last couple of years, especially during the Trump administration, Canada even admitted more Indian nationals than the United States did. And let's bear in mind, Canada has only 1/10 the population of America. So Canada absolutely has a come one, come all kind of attitude. And I think that's to be admired. And that's the role model that other countries will look to in the future, because they'll see high growth economies that are diversifying, that are creating jobs, that are attracting young people and building a future. And if you're a country that's trying to figure out what your immigration policy is, you're looking at the marketplace, if you will, you're not going to emulate Italy, right? You're not going to emulate Hungary, right? You're going to be looking at Canada and Germany and the United States under Biden, as your role models. And that's the right way. Those are the right countries to learn from.
I think Australia would also be something similar, you think? It's doing something
Australia has been, but as we know, there is again also a fairly deep-seated xenophobia, and it is a very distant Antipodean island continent nation. The COVID has, led to very heavy restrictions, obviously, on immigration. And so I think they have to really work things out. Historically, we treat Canada and Australia as almost parallel stories of wealthy resource economies with high immigration. I don't think that Australia is going to maintain that status in quite the way it has historically, and it certainly is not going to keep pace with Canada by any stretch of the imagination. So Canada will really be in a league of its own.
One region which has fascinated me in the world of migration history is the Gulf region. It's probably the only region which has really transformed itself phenomenally in a span of 40 years with mass immigration. In some countries of the Gulf, GCC countries, 80% of the country is foreign born, incredibly high immigration rates. And you've been there, you've also lived there for some time. How was migration viewed there now? After all these years, is there more acceptance? You mentioned some aspects of this in your book.
Yeah, to me, it's always been so fascinating, biographically, because I spent my childhood in the UAE and, visit there very, very regularly and work closely with the government. In fact, among other things, on this exact issue of their immigration policy. When you ask even the question, how is it viewed? I guess the answer is, first and foremost, by whom? Right? Because if the majority of the population is immigrants, of course, they're pro-immigration. The question you're really asking is, what do the Emiratis think about it? And the Emiratis, who again constitute 8 to 9% of the population, and we're mostly then talking about what's the opinion and the policy of the ruling elite, of the monarchy and of the technocrats. And they have tried for some time, going back 20 years, to look at this question of Emiratization. How do they maintain the core strength of their indigenous population amidst this relentless growth of the foreign, sort of residency? And they have managed to thread the needle somehow. There is a very strong and proud and core Emirati identity, precisely because of the country's phenomenal success economically and its diversification and the quality of its governance, its respect around the world, and so forth. And so they have managed to be truly the most outstanding and unique case in the world of a country where, it's so thoroughly diluted numerically, but there is a respect within the country for the authority, and the authority has, again, managed to nurture the indigenous population while becoming ever more welcoming to its global, resident pool. And therefore, it's done a phenomenal job. It's really, really worthy of further exploration, even if it remains kind of a sui generis case.
You end your book with a chapter called Civilization 3.0. Tell us some of the basic features of what you think is emerging.
Right, and this is really a macro evolutionary story, and it kind of goes back to that Northern Lights scenario we were talking about earlier. If Civilization 1.0 was the time at which we were nomadic, pastoral, and agricultural people, and then over the last, particularly just several hundred years, we became not only sedentary but industrial. Now I'm positing a Civilization 3.0 in which we are more mobile, either involuntarily or voluntarily, but we do so in a sustainable fashion. And we do have all of the technologies at our disposal today to move billions of people from climate-stressed regions, from politically volatile regions, from coastal regions towards inland regions, from low elevation towards higher elevation, and to do so sustainably, and to do so with 3D printed housing and through wastewater, rainwater collection, and hydroponic agriculture, and desalination. All of these technologies do make it possible for us to relocate large populations to climate resilient areas without destroying those climate resilient areas the way we've already destroyed so many ecosystems. So my vision of Civilization 3.0 is at the intersection of mobility and sustainability, and indeed mobility for very, very large numbers of people, far larger than we've ever witnessed in any century before. And again, that's not a wish. In a way, it's a response. It's a response to the fact that we have created these complex circumstances of political unrest and of climate change. We have caused the factors that are pushing us, and now we have to build the systems that respond to that push. And this is why I sort of think of this as a preemptive mandate to, in a predetermined way, to pre-design the infrastructures, the habitats, the settlements, the communities, the cities, the methods of mobility, the legal architecture, the digital passports that I talk about, to do all of those things that a highly mobile world is going to require.
I look at the 21st century as a battle between cosmopolitanism on the one side and nativism on the other. And your book is a very clear call for more cosmopolitanism. At the same time, I think the general drift in the world right now is towards nativism. Is it short-lived as, say, the 1930s, the interwar period where the world shut itself down only to re-globalize further? Is this a long-lived trend? Your book makes it very clear that this is inevitable. We need, not only will there be more migration and it's good for humanity, but how would you talk to a nativist who says, my culture is being diluted, I feel very uncomfortable with this, which I think is an important part of political manifestos across the world today.
Absolutely, it is. I talk to nativists all the time. It's part of my research and it's part of the work that I do, on the ground. And I confront nativists. I get in their face because I say, you are responsible for the lonely death of your own parents. How's that for a punchline? How's that for a retort? Right? I will walk up to a townsman in East Germany in a village where they voted for a far right party, and I'll say, that your parents are going to die alone because you're an anti-immigrant, right? And you're not allowing in immigrants that are going to care for your elderly people. You are responsible for your society becoming less civilized, almost barbaric, to not be taking care of your parents, right? And you're responsible, of course, for the decay of public infrastructure, declining quality of education and public services, because you're not voting to import a new generation of people that will pay taxes and provide essential services in your society. So I'm more than happy to speak to nativists, as you can tell, and even if I didn't, quite frankly, they would die off, because there is a very clear generational divide between nativists and cosmopolitans. And the fact is that young people overwhelmingly subscribe to post-national values, believe in connectivity as a human right, mobility as a human right, sustainability as a human right. And they think horizontally about identity, generationally, in terms of causes, whereas older people think more nationally and vertically and ethnically. So I'm not really worried about the triumph of a global identity by almost in a de facto sense, because of this generational change that's presently underway, which is why generational change is such a big theme in this book, and why, for me, the protagonists of the book are the 4 billion young people of the world, because they are the most mobile generation in the history of the world. And believe me, they will vote with their feet.
Let's talk about mobile phones as we wrap this segment. Mobile phones have completely transformed the experience of mobility. How do you see that playing out in the future? Is it going to make the virtual experience, on par with the existing? Because I'm coming from this idea that in the 20th century, people still longed for something like the home, because you were with your family, you would write these letters. But today you can see people as they are talking, being thousands of kilometers away. Has that fundamentally transformed the meaning of mobility? It doesn't really matter where you live anymore.
No, it does matter, though. You always have to be somewhere. You need electricity supply. And that's something that we often underestimate. We say, oh, I've got a mobile phone, I've got an internet connection. Why do I need to go and pay such high rent in a big city? But as I mentioned before, most of the world population is motivated to urbanize by far more prosaic Maslowian kinds of goals that are most, beneficially achieved in cities. So people will move even in a world of nearly 100% mobile penetration. After all, the test is reality. We already live in a world of nearly 100% mobile penetration, and still people are moving like never before. So it's hardly a hypothetical, it's reality today. People will take that mobility with them in a way. And when we broaden your question to include cryptocurrencies, mobile bank accounts, mobile banking in general, digital identity, digital pensions, all of those services that used to be rooted geographically and provided by a government that are now portable, all that does is further enable greater mobility. And that's exactly what it's doing. So I've come to the conclusion that every single thing that people think of as pinning people down actually does the opposite. It further uproots people. And I've still not come across anyone who can prove that wrong. I'll give you one last example of this, by the way, and it's conscription, right? We think of conscription, military conscription, as mandatory, as being a sign of genuine loyalty to the nation. So I looked at countries that have mandatory conscription policies outside of Western Europe. And lo and behold, those are the countries that every young person wants to get the hell out of, right? So those policies that we associate with nationalism and rootedness are precisely the policies that drive young people away. So any way you slice it, people are going to move, and especially young people are going to pursue their own sense of belonging and their own priorities in life, and not be tied down by family or by nation. And personally, I celebrate that world, and I think that we need to retrofit our political, economic, and social systems around the priorities of youth, because they are, of course, literally the future.
Last question to you, which you mentioned in the book: where would you see yourself living in the year 2050?
I do have one exact answer to this, and for those who know me, it's already they're rolling their eyes, but it's Berlin, because as I said, I've been living in and out of Berlin for 30 years. It's like home to me. The people of Berlin, as much as they also come and go, treat me like the Berliner, that I think of myself as being. So it really is, my home away from home, you might say. So at some point or the other, I'll wind up there. There's no question. I even have a burial site chosen for myself in Berlin.
I'll end here by saying that I find it very interesting that many people of Indian origin have written wonderful books on migration. I think it started in the 1930s with the sociologist Radhakamal Mukherjee, wrote a book called Migrant Asia. Very few people know about it. The Italian economist Corrado Gini wrote the foreword for that book. In that book, he talked about how the world should see more migration. It's the best thing that can happen for global human welfare. More recently, Suketu Mehta has written the book. And now we have Parag Khanna writing an excellent book called Move. Grab a copy of it. Explains in a very nice nutshell what's happening around the world and also what's expected to happen in the coming century.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to join you.
Great. Thanks, Parag.
Thank you, Parag and Chinmay, for this insightful session. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. Sessions are ongoing across all three of our venues: Frontlawn, Bank of Baroda Mughal Tent, and Darbar Hall. Stay tuned for the next session.